On a scorching summer morning in 2001, in a small Texas town where everyone knew their neighbors and doors were left unlocked, a young woman named Kimberly Nees Saenz vanished without a trace. She was 23 years old, a mother of two, with auburn hair and a shy smile that rarely reached her eyes. She lived in Lufkin, a timber town in the piney woods of East Texas, where the humidity hung thick as curtains and secrets festered in the stillness. On June 17, 2001, Kimberly left her children with her mother, told her family she was meeting a friend, and drove away in her white Honda Accord. By nightfall, her car had been found abandoned in a Walmart parking lot 15 miles away, keys still in the ignition, her purse tucked beneath the driver's seat. But Kimberly was gone. In the weeks that followed, search parties combed the dense pine forests and muddy creek beds. Bloodhounds lost her scent at the parking lot's edge. Investigators found no signs of struggle, no witnesses, no body. Just silence. And in that silence, a question hung over Angelina County like the thick summer heat. Where was Kimberly Saenz, and who was the last person to see her alive? Lufkin sits in the heart of East Texas, about 120 miles north of Houston, surrounded by the Davy Crockett and Angelina National Forests. It's timber country, where logging trucks rumble down narrow highways, and the air smells of pine sap and red clay. In 2001, the town had about 32,000 people, most of them connected by 3 or 4 degrees of separation. The kind of place where your third-grade teacher was your neighbor's aunt, where Friday nights meant high school football, and where everyone attended the same handful of churches. Main Street still had a few old storefronts with fading signs, though Walmart had pulled most of the business to the highway. The town square featured a courthouse built in the 1950s, red brick with white columns, surrounded by live oaks draped in Spanish moss. Kimberly Nees had grown up in this town. She was the middle child in a family of 5, raised in a modest ranch-style house on the south side near the old railroad tracks. Her father worked at the Temple Inland Lumber Mill. Her mother cleaned houses for extra income. Kimberly had been a quiet girl, according to those who knew her in high school. She kept to herself, made decent grades, wore her hair long and straight. She'd gotten pregnant at 19, married the father quickly in a small ceremony at First Baptist Church. The marriage lasted less than a year. By 21, she had 2 children, 2 different fathers, and was living in a cramped apartment off Highway 59, working the night shift at a Brookshire Brothers grocery store. Her mother, Linda Nees, helped with the kids, a boy aged 4 and a girl aged 2. Linda would later tell investigators that Kimberly seemed tired all the time, that she'd been struggling with something she wouldn't name. The morning of June 17, 2001, was already hot by 8 a.m., the temperature climbing toward 95 degrees. Kimberly had worked until midnight the night before, stocking shelves and running the register during the slow hours. She'd gotten home around 12:30, slept fitfully according to her neighbor who heard her television playing through the thin walls. By 9 a.m., she was awake, drinking coffee in her small kitchen. The apartment smelled like stale cigarette smoke and baby formula. Her daughter was playing with blocks on the worn carpet. Her son was watching cartoons, the volume turned up too loud. At 10:15, Kimberly loaded both children into her white 1997 Honda Accord. The car had a dent in the rear bumper and a crack across the windshield. She drove them to her mother's house, a 10-minute trip through residential streets lined with weathered homes and chain-link fences. Linda Nees was waiting on the front porch, sweating in the shade of an oscillating fan. Kimberly seemed distracted, Linda would later recall. She didn't come inside. She stood on the porch steps, car keys dangling from her fingers, and said she had to meet someone. When Linda asked who, Kimberly just shrugged and said it was nobody important, just someone from work. She kissed her children quickly on their foreheads, walked back to her car, and drove away. Linda stood on the porch and watched the white Honda disappear around the corner, noting the time on the clock in her living room. 10:42 a.m. That was the last time anyone in Kimberly's family saw her. By 6 p.m., when Kimberly hadn't returned or called, Linda began to worry. She tried Kimberly's pager, the only way to reach her, but got no response. At 7:30, as the sun was setting in streaks of orange and purple, Linda called the Lufkin Police Department. The dispatcher took her information but explained that an adult couldn't be considered missing until 24 hours had passed. Linda spent the night calling Kimberly's friends, the few she knew, asking if anyone had seen her daughter. No one had. At 8:15 the next morning, June 18th, a Walmart employee arriving for the early shift noticed a white Honda Accord parked alone in the far corner of the lot. The car had been there all night, which was unusual. The employee wrote down the license plate number and called it in to management. By 9 a.m., a Lufkin police patrol officer had run the plates and discovered the vehicle was registered to Kimberly Nees Saenz. The officer approached the car cautiously, checked the doors, found them unlocked. The keys were in the ignition. Kimberly's purse was beneath the seat, her wallet still inside with $43 and her driver's license. Her cell phone charger was plugged into the cigarette lighter, but there was no phone, no signs of struggle, no blood. The car was simply sitting there as if someone had parked it and walked away. The search began that same morning. Lufkin Police and Angelina County Sheriff's deputies organized volunteer teams to comb the wooded areas surrounding the Walmart. The store sat on the northern edge of town near Highway 69, bordered by thick pine forest and scrubland. Volunteers arrived with flashlights and machetes, cutting through underbrush, calling Kimberly's name. Bloodhounds from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice were brought in. The dogs picked up Kimberly's scent from the driver's seat, tracked it across the parking lot to the edge of the asphalt, and then lost it completely. It was as if she had simply evaporated. By the afternoon, news crews from Lufkin and Nacogdoches had set up cameras in the Walmart parking lot. Reporters interviewed Linda Nees, who stood in the brutal sun, mascara streaking down her cheeks, begging anyone with information to come forward. Kimberly's photograph appeared on the local news that evening, a snapshot from Christmas, showing her in a red sweater, smiling faintly, holding her daughter on her lap. The Lufkin Daily News ran the story on the front page the next morning. Local mother missing, car found abandoned. Investigators began piecing together Kimberly's last known movements. They interviewed her coworkers at Brookshire Brothers, who said she'd seemed normal the night before she disappeared, maybe quieter than usual. They interviewed her ex-husband, who had an alibi, and the father of her second child, who claimed he hadn't seen her in months. They pulled security footage from the Walmart, but the camera angles didn't cover the far corner of the lot where her car had been found. They checked her bank records and discovered she'd withdrawn $60 from an ATM inside the store at 11:20 a.m. on June 17th, just 38 minutes after she'd left her mother's house. The timestamp placed her inside the Walmart shortly before noon, but after that, nothing. Clear's throat, the investigation intensified over the following week. Angelina County Sheriff's investigators took the lead, coordinating with the Texas Rangers. They drained a retention pond behind the Walmart. They searched abandoned buildings along Highway 69. They interviewed everyone Kimberly had contact with in the weeks before she vanished. Several people mentioned that Kimberly had been seeing someone new, a man she was hesitant to talk about. When pressed, her coworkers said they'd seen her talking to him a few times in the parking lot after her shifts. He drove a dark pickup truck. He was older than Kimberly, maybe in his 40s. One coworker, a 19-year-old named Jessica Morno, remembered something specific. She'd seen Kimberly getting into a black Ford F-150 around midnight on June 16th, the night before she disappeared. Jessica had been walking to her own car when she noticed Kimberly in the passenger seat, talking to the driver. The truck had pulled away before Jessica could get a good look at the man. Investigators ran down every lead. They compiled a list of all black Ford F-150s registered in Angelina County. There were over 200. They began interviewing owners, one by one, showing them Kimberly's photograph, asking where they'd been on the morning of June 17th. Most had alibis. Some didn't. But none stood out as particularly suspicious until they reached the name of Michael Wayne Anderson. Michael Anderson was 42 years old in 2001. He lived in a single-wide trailer on a dirt road outside Lufkin, about 8 miles from the Walmart. He worked construction, mostly framing houses, and had a reputation in town as a drinker and a drifter. He'd been married twice, divorced twice, and had 3 children he rarely saw. Those who knew him said he was charming when he wanted to be, but that he had a temper that flared without warning. He drove a black 1998 Ford F-150, dented and muddy, with a toolbox bolted to the bed. When deputies arrived at his trailer on June 22nd, 5 days after Kimberly vanished, Anderson was sitting on his porch, drinking a beer in the midday heat. He invited them inside without hesitation. The trailer was a mess, clothes piled on the couch, empty beer cans stacked on the counter. Anderson was cooperative, polite even. He said yes, he knew Kimberly. They'd met a few weeks earlier at a bar called the Silver Spur, off Highway 94. They'd talked a few times, gone out for drinks once or twice. He admitted he'd given her a ride home from work on the night of June 16th, but said he'd dropped her off at her apartment around 12:30 a.m. and hadn't seen her since. The deputies asked if he knew where Kimberly was. Anderson shook his head, said he had no idea, that he was worried about her too. They asked him what he'd done on the morning of June 17th. Anderson said he'd slept late, woke up around 10:30, drove into town to pick up some materials at Home Depot around 11, then spent the afternoon working on a framing job near Zavala. He gave them the name of the contractor he'd been working for. The deputies wrote everything down, thanked him, and left. But something didn't sit right. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves after the interview. Anderson had been too calm, too helpful. He hadn't asked any follow-up questions about Kimberly, hadn't seemed particularly concerned, and his timeline was vague. They checked with the contractor in Zavala, who confirmed that Anderson had been on the job site that afternoon, but couldn't say exactly what time he'd arrived. They pulled Anderson's credit card records and found a charge at Home Depot on June 17th at 11:04 a.m. But that still left a gap. The drive from Anderson's trailer to Lufkin was about 20 minutes. If he'd slept late and left his trailer around 10:30, he would have arrived in town around 10:50. The Walmart was less than 5 minutes from Home Depot. He could have been at the Walmart between 11 and 11:15, right around the time Kimberly was withdrawing money from the ATM. Investigators decided to dig deeper. They obtained a search warrant for Anderson's truck and trailer. On June 25th, a forensic team spent 6 hours going through his property. They found nothing obvious, no blood, no signs of struggle. But in the bed of his truck beneath a tarp, they found a length of rope and a roll of duct tape. Anderson claimed he used them for work. In his trailer, tucked in a drawer beside his bed, they found a photograph of Kimberly. It was a Polaroid taken at night showing her standing beside his truck, smiling hesitantly. On the back in pen, someone had written, K. June 15. When confronted, Anderson said Kimberly had given him the photo. He said they'd been dating, that it wasn't serious, but that he'd liked her. He stuck to his story. He hadn't seen her after dropping her off on the night of June 16th. Investigators brought in cadaver dogs to search Anderson's property and the surrounding woods. The dogs alerted in several spots, but no remains were found. They brought Anderson in for multiple interviews over the following weeks. Each time his story remained consistent. He was sorry about Kimberly, he said. He hoped she'd be found safe, but he didn't know where she was. Without a body, without physical evidence, without a witness, the case began to stall. Anderson was never arrested. By late July, the search teams were called off. The media coverage faded. Kimberly's photograph was added to missing person databases across Texas and the nation. Her mother, Linda, continued to call the sheriff's office every week, asking if there were any updates. There never were. The case went cold. Months turned into years. Life in Lufkin moved on as it always does. The white Honda Accord was returned to Linda Nees, who couldn't bring herself to drive it and eventually sold it to a junkyard. Kimberly's apartment was cleaned out, her belongings stored in boxes in Linda's garage. The children grew older, asking fewer and fewer questions about their mother, though her absence hung over the family like a shadow. Michael Anderson continued to work construction jobs around Angelina County. He moved out of the trailer and into a small house on the west side of Lufkin. He remarried in 2003, a woman named Teresa who worked at a Dollar General. Those who knew Anderson said he seemed to have settled down, that he'd quit drinking so much, that he was trying to turn his life around. But there were whispers. People in town hadn't forgotten. At the hardware store and the grocery store aisles, people would see Michael Anderson and feel a chill. They didn't know anything for certain, but they suspected. They wondered. Clears throat. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the gnawing suspicion that the person sleeping beside you might be capable of something unthinkable, you understand the quiet terror that settled into Teresa Anderson's life. By 2005, Teresa had been married to Michael for 2 years. On the surface, their life seemed ordinary. They lived in a 2-bedroom house with a small yard, a rusted swing set, and a vegetable garden that never quite flourished. Michael worked long hours, came home tired, drank a few beers and fell asleep on the couch. Teresa worked at the Dollar General, stocking shelves and running the register, making just enough to cover groceries and utilities. They didn't talk much. When they did, it was about bills or what needed fixing around the house. But there were things Teresa noticed, small things that accumulated over time like dust on a windowsill. She noticed that Michael didn't like to talk about his past. If she asked about his previous relationships, he'd shut down, change the subject, or leave the room. She noticed that he kept a locked toolbox in the garage, and when she asked what was inside, he told her it was none of her business. She noticed that sometimes, late at night, she'd wake up and find him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, a beer sweating in his hand. She noticed that he never wanted to drive past the Walmart on Highway 69, would take long detours to avoid it. And she noticed that he had nightmares. He'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, muttering words she couldn't understand. Once, in the fall of 2006, she heard him cry out in his sleep, a name, Kimberly. When she shook him awake, he looked at her with eyes that seemed hollow, empty. She asked him who Kimberly was. He told her it was nobody, just someone he used to know. Teresa didn't press, but she didn't forget either. By 2007, the marriage was fraying. They argued more frequently about money, about his drinking, about the silence that filled their house like stagnant water. Teresa began to feel afraid, though she couldn't have said exactly why. Michael had never hit her, never threatened her directly, but there was something in the way he looked at her sometimes, a coldness that made her stomach tighten. In August of that year, during a particularly heated argument, Michael grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave bruises. Teresa packed a bag that night and drove to her sister's house in Nacogdoches. She told her sister she couldn't go back, that something was wrong with Michael, that she didn't feel safe. Her sister asked if Michael had hurt her. Teresa showed her the bruises. Her sister suggested she file a police report. Teresa hesitated but eventually agreed. On August 14, 2007, she went to the Lufkin Police Department and filed a report for assault. The officer taking her statement asked routine questions. Had this happened before? Was there any history of violence? Had Teresa ever felt her life was in danger? Teresa answered carefully, then, after a long pause, asked the officer if he'd ever heard the name Kimberly Saenz. The officer looked up from his notes. Yes, he said, everyone in the department knew that name. Why? Teresa told him that her husband, Michael Anderson, had known Kimberly, that investigators had questioned him years ago, that Michael still had nightmares, that he still muttered her name in his sleep. The officer wrote everything down, told Teresa he'd pass the information along to the detectives who'd worked the case. That report sat on a desk for 3 weeks before anyone followed up. On September 5, 2007, Detective Mark Harmon from the Angelina County Sheriff's Office called Teresa Anderson and asked if she'd be willing to come in for an interview. She agreed. Over the course of 2 hours, Teresa recounted everything she'd noticed over the past 4 years. The nightmares, the locked toolbox, the way Michael avoided the Walmart, the name he'd cried out in his sleep. She told Detective Harmon that she believed Michael knew more about Kimberly's disappearance than he'd ever admitted. She said she was terrified of him, that she'd filed for divorce and was staying with her sister. She said she wanted to help in any way she could. Detective Harmon reopened the case file on Kimberly Nees Saenz. He started by re-interviewing everyone who'd been questioned in 2001. He discovered that 2 of Kimberly's coworkers, including Jessica Morno, had moved out of state and were difficult to track down. He found the Polaroid photograph of Kimberly that had been seized from Michael's trailer, now stored in evidence. He reviewed the timeline again, noting the gaps, the inconsistencies. He decided to bring Michael Anderson in for another interview. On September 12, 2007, Detective Harmon and a Texas Ranger named Robert Villanueva knocked on the door of Michael Anderson's house. Anderson answered, older now, grayer, the lines in his face deeper. He seemed unsurprised to see them. He invited them inside, offered them coffee. They sat in his living room, surrounded by hunting magazines and empty beer bottles. Harmon asked Anderson if he'd be willing to answer some more questions about Kimberly Saenz. Anderson shrugged and said sure, though he didn't know what else he could tell them. They went through the timeline again. Where had Anderson been on the morning of June 17, 2001? Anderson repeated what he'd said 6 years earlier. He'd slept late, gone to Home Depot, then worked on a framing job. Harmon asked if Anderson had seen Kimberly that morning. Anderson said no. Harmon asked why Anderson's wife had told police that he had nightmares about Kimberly. Anderson's face darkened. He said his wife was lying, that she was trying to get back at him for the divorce. Harmon asked Anderson if he'd ever been to the Walmart on Highway 69. Anderson said yes, of course. Everyone in town had been to that Walmart. Harmon asked if Anderson had been there on June 17, 2001. Anderson paused just for a second, then said he didn't remember. The interview lasted 3 hours. Anderson never asked for a lawyer. He remained calm, polite, cooperative. But Detective Harmon noticed something. Every time Harmon mentioned a specific detail, Anderson's story shifted slightly, just enough to accommodate the new information. Harmon decided to try a different approach. He told Anderson that they had new evidence, that a witness had come forward who'd seen Anderson's truck in the Walmart parking lot on the morning Kimberly disappeared. This was a bluff. No such witness existed. Anderson's expression didn't change. He said the witness must be mistaken. Harmon pressed harder. He said they had forensic evidence from Anderson's truck. Another bluff. Anderson shifted in his seat, crossed his arms. He said he wanted to talk to a lawyer. The interview ended. Anderson was not arrested. There was still no body, no physical evidence linking him to Kimberly's disappearance. But Detective Harmon knew, in the way that investigators sometimes know, that Michael Anderson was hiding something. Over the following months, Harmon worked the case quietly. He obtained search warrants for Anderson's phone records from 2001, hoping to find a connection, but the records had been purged years earlier. He hired a cadaver dog handler to search Anderson's property again. The dogs alerted near a burned pile in the backyard, but excavation revealed only animal bones. He re-interviewed Anderson's ex-wives, his coworkers, his drinking buddies from the Silver Spur. Several people mentioned that Anderson had a temper, that he'd been in bar fights, that he'd once threatened a man with a tire iron, but no one could definitively place him with Kimberly on the morning she vanished. By early 2008, the case seemed to be stalling again. And then, on March 3, 2008, a hunter walking through the woods off County Road 307, about 12 miles southeast of Lufkin, stumbled across something that made him stop. Partially buried beneath fallen leaves and pine needles, near the edge of a creek bed, were human remains. The Angelina County Sheriff's Office was notified immediately. Forensic investigators cordoned off the area and began the painstaking process of excavation. The remains were skeletal, scattered by animals and time. Over the course of 3 days, investigators recovered a nearly complete skeleton, along with fragments of clothing, denim jeans, a torn t-shirt, a single sneaker. Dental records were pulled and compared. On March 8, 2008, nearly 7 years after she disappeared, the remains were positively identified as Kimberly Nees Saenz. The news broke that evening. Linda Nees collapsed when the detective told her. The Lufkin Daily News ran the headline, "Missing Woman's Remains Found After 7 Years." Reporters descended on Angelina County, interviewing anyone who remembered the case. Michael Anderson's name resurfaced immediately. People whispered. The sheriff's office declined to comment on suspects or ongoing investigations. The remains were sent to the medical examiner's office in Houston for analysis. Because of the decomposition and skeletal condition, determining cause of death was difficult, but the medical examiner noted several fractures to the skull, consistent with blunt force trauma. The hyoid bone in the neck was also fractured, which could indicate strangulation. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide. Detective Harmon now had a body. He returned to Michael Anderson. On March 15, 2008, Anderson was arrested at his home and charged with the murder of Kimberly Nees Saenz. He did not resist. As deputies led him to the patrol car in handcuffs, neighbors stood on their porches, watching. Anderson kept his head down, said nothing. The arrest made the front page of every newspaper in East Texas. In the months leading up to trial, prosecutors built their case methodically. They had the timeline. Anderson had been one of the last people to see Kimberly alive, had driven her home the night before she disappeared, and had no solid alibi for the morning of June 17th. They had the photograph found in his trailer, proof that he'd been involved with Kimberly. They had testimony from Teresa Anderson about his nightmares and erratic behavior. They had the location where Kimberly's remains were found, along County Road 307, a route Anderson frequently drove for work. They had cadaver dogs that had alerted on his property. And they had the medical examiner's determination. Kimberly had been murdered. What they didn't have was a confession, a murder weapon, or forensic evidence directly linking Anderson to the crime scene. The trial began in November 2009, more than 8 years after Kimberly's disappearance. The courtroom in the Angelina County Courthouse was packed. Linda Nees sat in the front row every day, flanked by family members, clutching a photograph of her daughter. Michael Anderson sat at the defense table, wearing a suit that hung loose on his frame, his face expressionless. The prosecution called witness after witness. Jessica Morneau, now living in Oklahoma, testified that she'd seen Kimberly get into Anderson's truck the night before she vanished. Teresa Anderson testified about the nightmares, the locked toolbox, the way Michael avoided talking about his past. The medical examiner testified about the skull fractures, the broken hyoid bone, the manner of death. Investigators testified about the timeline, the gaps in Anderson's alibi, the location of the remains. The defense argued that the prosecution's case was circumstantial. Yes, Anderson had known Kimberly. Yes, he'd driven her home the night before she disappeared, but that didn't make him a murderer. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. No DNA, no fingerprints, no murder weapon. The defense suggested that Kimberly could have been killed by anyone, that the remains had been found in a remote area accessible to hundreds of people. They painted Anderson as an easy target, a man with a rough past who'd been railroaded by investigators desperate to solve a cold case. The trial lasted 3 weeks. On December 2, 2009, the jury began deliberations. They deliberated for 14 hours over 2 days. On December 3rd, they returned a verdict, guilty of murder. Michael Anderson showed no reaction as the verdict was read. Linda Nees sobbed quietly, her hands covering her face. The judge scheduled sentencing for January 2010. At sentencing, Linda Nees was allowed to make a victim impact statement. She stood at the podium, her voice shaking, and spoke directly to Michael Anderson. She said, "You took my daughter from me. You took a mother from her children. You stole years of our lives, years we spent not knowing, not being able to grieve, not being able to say goodbye. I hope you carry that with you every day for the rest of your life." Anderson stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. The judge sentenced Michael Wayne Anderson to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. He was led out of the courtroom in shackles, transported to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, and processed into the system. As of today, he remains incarcerated at the Ramsey Unit in Rosharon, Texas. He has never admitted to killing Kimberly Nees Saenz. He has never explained what happened on the morning of June 17, 2001, or how her body ended up in the woods off County Road 307. The case officially is closed, but questions linger. What exactly happened in those missing hours between when Kimberly withdrew money from the Walmart ATM and when her car was found abandoned? Was she meeting Anderson, or was it someone else? Why did he do it? Was it an argument that spiraled out of control, or something more calculated? Kimberly's remains were cremated, her ashes scattered in the pine forest she'd grown up around. Her children, now adults, have tried to build lives separate from the shadow of their mother's murder. Linda Nees still lives in Lufkin, though she rarely leaves her house. She keeps Kimberly's photograph on the mantle, next to candles that she lights every year on the anniversary of her daughter's disappearance. This case is a reminder that justice, when it comes, is often slow and incomplete. It took 7 years to find Kimberly's body, 8 years to bring her killer to trial. For the family, those years were filled with not knowing, with suspicion and grief and the terrible hope that somehow, someday, Kimberly might still walk through the door. The answers they finally received didn't erase the pain, but they provided something essential. The knowledge that Kimberly hadn't simply vanished, that someone was held accountable, that her life and her death mattered. In small towns like Lufkin, where everyone knows everyone, where secrets fester and rumors spread, cases like this leave scars that never fully heal. People still talk about Kimberly Saenz, about the summer she disappeared, about Michael Anderson and the questions he never answered. They remember the search parties, the vigils, the years of uncertainty. And they remember that sometimes the person responsible is hiding in plain sight, living among us, until the truth finally catches up. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.